Last week, when headlines once again mentioned heightened patrols near Sabah and quiet diplomatic conversations in Kuala Lumpur, something struck me. Not what was said, but what wasn't. Every time Sabah makes the news, the script feels familiar. It's always framed as Malaysia versus the Philippines. The old claim of the Sultanate of Sulu gets dusted off. Commentators rehearse the same lines. And Indonesia? It's usually treated like a bystander, a neighbor watching from across the maritime fence. But here's the uncomfortable question no one really asks out loud. Is Indonesia truly just a spectator in Sabah? Or is it a silent stakeholder with far more at stake than we admit? Because geography doesn't lie, and history doesn't forget. Sabah sits on the northern edge of Borneo, facing the Sulu Sea and the Celebes Sea, waters that directly touch Indonesia's Kalimantan. To pretend Indonesia has no stake is like saying a fire next door isn't your concern because your name isn't on the property title. Maybe you don't own the house, but the smoke still drifts into your window. Officially, Indonesia has no legal claim to Sabah. Unlike the Philippines, Jakarta does not assert historical sovereignty rooted in the old sultanate structures. Malaysia administers Sabah. End of story, at least on paper. But sovereignty on paper and security in practice are two very different things. Think about it. Tens of thousands of Indonesian workers live in Sabah. Many cross legally. Some don't. Families stretch across invisible maritime lines. Fishing routes blur. Smuggling routes blur even more. Armed groups in the past have exploited the porous maritime border between Mindanao, Sabah, and Indonesian territory. The Sulu Celebes Seas have long been a corridor of trade and occasionally a corridor of instability. If Sabah sneezes, eastern Indonesia doesn't just hear it. It feels like it. And that's where the distinction becomes crucial. There's a difference between being a claimant state and being a strategic stakeholder. Indonesia is not knocking on Sabah's door demanding ownership. But it absolutely has material interests tied to what happens there. Maritime security, counterterrorism coordination, labor migration flows, fisheries management, border control. I remember speaking with a regional analyst who once told me, half-jokingly, in Southeast Asia, proximity is destiny. That line stayed with me, because it explains so much of the Sabah dynamic. Indonesia's entire doctrine of territorial integrity, born from its own long and painful post-colonial consolidation, makes it deeply sensitive to questions of secession, cross-border insurgency, and gray zone ambiguity. Jakarta has spent decades guarding against fragmentation within its own archipelago. The last thing it wants is instability festering right along its maritime frontier. And then there's the demographic reality. Sabah is not some distant corner of the map for Indonesia. It's practically within arm's reach of Kalimantan. With Indonesia currently investing heavily in its new capital Nusantara in East Kalimantan, the strategic gravity of that region is shifting. The eastern maritime flank is no longer peripheral. It's central. That changes how Jakarta calculates risk. So maybe the real issue isn't whether Indonesia has a claim to Sabah. It doesn't. The deeper question is whether we've underestimated how much Indonesia cares about what happens there and how quietly it works to ensure the status quo doesn't unravel. Because in Southeast Asia, sovereignty may be defined by treaties. But stability? Stability is defined by proximity, memory, and hard-earned lessons about what happens when borders become fluid. Sabah may not be Indonesia's territory, but it is absolutely within Indonesia's strategic horizon. And that distinction, subtle, often ignored, might be far more important than the legal debate everyone keeps repeating. When people ask whether Indonesia ever had grounds over Sabah, I think the real issue is this. Are we talking about history as it actually unfolded? Or history as we wish it had been drawn on a map? Because if we go far enough back, the map looks completely different. Long before Indonesia or Malaysia existed as nation-states, the Sulu Sea and the Celebes Sea functioned as one interconnected economic space. They weren't frontiers, they were corridors. Trade moved constantly between Sulawesi, Mindanao, and North Borneo. Maritime Southeast Asia operated like a living network, ports linked by wind patterns and kinship ties rather than customs checkpoints. Bugis and Makassarese traders from Sulawesi were deeply embedded in this world from the 17th to 19th centuries. They sailed widely, established trading communities, forged alliances, and in some cases settled in parts of North Borneo, including what is now eastern Sabah. Their presence was commercial and social. It was influenced through mobility, not conquest through formal annexation. And this is where we need to be careful with modern vocabulary. Pre-colonial Southeast Asia didn't operate on strict territorial sovereignty. It functioned through what scholars describe as a mandala-style system of authority. Power radiated outward from political centers. Influence overlapped. Allegiances could shift. Coastal zones were often layered spaces of shared interaction rather than fenced-off territories. If you were a sailor from southern Sulawesi docking in eastern Sabah in the 18th century, you were not crossing into a clearly demarcated foreign state. You were moving within a maritime ecosystem. Migration flows between Sulawesi and eastern Sabah long predated colonial boundaries. Families moved for fishing, seasonal labor, trade, or marriage. Some returned home. Some stayed. Communities developed across what later became international lines. These movements were normal, not exceptional. But, and this distinction matters, historical connectivity is not the same as sovereign control. There was no Indonesian republic exercising administrative authority over North Borneo. There was no formal Indonesian claim because there was no Indonesian state yet. The modern concept of exclusive territorial sovereignty simply didn't apply to that earlier system. Then, Europe intervened and everything hardened. The 1824 Anglo-Dutch Treaty divided British and Dutch spheres of influence in the region. It was a geopolitical bargain made far from the waters it affected. The Dutch consolidated control over the southern part of Borneo, integrating it into what became the Dutch East Indies. The British expanded influence northward. By 1881, the British North Borneo Company was administering Sabah under a charter. North Borneo was placed firmly within a British imperial structure, separate from Dutch-controlled territories to the south. The once fluid maritime world was segmented into colonial jurisdictions. Those colonial borders would prove decisive. When Indonesia gained sovereignty in 1949, it inherited the territorial boundaries of the former Dutch East Indies. That inheritance did not include North Borneo. Legally and diplomatically, there was no transferred Dutch claim to Sabah that Jakarta could inherit. The border lines drawn under colonial rule became the starting point of Indonesia's international legal identity. So by mid-20th century standards, Indonesia had no inherited territorial claim to North Borneo. But then came the episode that often complicates this discussion: Konfrontasi. Between 1963 and 1966, Indonesia under President Sukarno opposed the formation of Malaysia. Jakarta incursions into Sabah and Sarawak. Roughly 590 armed incidents were recorded during the conflict. Casualty estimates vary, but approximately 114 Indonesian personnel and around 590 Commonwealth forces were killed. It was tense. It was real. It involved military activity on and around Sabah's territory. But here is the crucial analytical clarification. Indonesia's opposition was ideological and geopolitical, not territorial in the sense of seeking to annex Sabah. Jakarta never formally asserted sovereignty over Sabah. It did not claim Sabah as Indonesian territory. The objective was to challenge and destabilize what it saw as a Western-sponsored federation on its periphery, not to absorb North Borneo into Indonesia. That distinction matters. Confrontasi demonstrated that Indonesia cared deeply about the political configuration of its neighborhood. It was willing to use force to contest what it perceived as neo-colonial influence. But even at the height of confrontation, Jakarta did not transform its position into a legal claim over Sabah. All right, let's strip this down to brass tacks. If we're talking strictly legal positions, not history, not emotion, not geopolitics, but law, documents, signatures, filings, then the answer is actually very clear. Indonesia does not have a territorial claim over Sabah. Full stop. Jakarta formally recognizes Sabah as part of Malaysia. There has been no submission to the International Court of Justice, no UN filing asserting competing sovereignty, no diplomatic campaign suggesting otherwise. Bilateral agreements between Indonesia and Malaysia operate on the assumption that Sabah is Malaysian territory. That's the baseline. And in international law, what you don't claim matters just as much as what you do. This isn't ambiguous. It isn't a coded language. Indonesia's legal position is straightforward. There is no Indonesian territorial claim to Sabah. Now, where things get more complex and honestly more interesting is at sea. Because while Indonesia does not contest Sabah as land territory, maritime boundaries in the Celebes Sea, which Indonesia calls the Sulawesi Sea, have long been sensitive. Overlapping claims in parts of the seabed and exclusive economic zones created friction for decades. The 2002 International Court of Justice decision over Sipadan and Ligitan is important here. The court awarded both islands to Malaysia. Indonesia accepted the ruling. That acceptance was significant. It reinforced Jakarta's commitment to legal resolution rather than territorial escalation. Then in 2023, Indonesia and Malaysia reached a maritime boundary agreement resolving part of their overlapping EEZ claims in the Sulawesi Sea. It didn't eliminate every technical issue, but it reduced ambiguity. That's not the behavior of a state quietly preparing a sovereignty challenge. That's the behavior of two neighbors trying to stabilize their maritime interface. But here's where the strategic math kicks in. Indonesia has the second longest coastline in the world, roughly 54,700 kilometers. It is the world's largest archipelagic state. Maritime space isn't peripheral to Indonesia, it is central to its identity, economy, and security doctrine. And Sabah sits right along that maritime equation. Under UNCLOS, exclusive economic zones extend 200 nautical miles from baselines, unless overlapping with another state. When Sabah's coast projects outward, it shapes Malaysia's EEZ footprint. And that footprint directly intersects with Indonesia's. So while Indonesia does not care about Sabah as land to annex, it absolutely cares about how Sabah's coastline affects maritime delimitation. That's the real stake. Fishing rights, energy exploration, seabed resources, sea lanes, naval movement corridors. All of that flows from maritime boundaries, not flags planted on hills. Sometimes I think people get distracted by the dramatic version of sovereignty disputes, the idea of tanks crossing borders or politicians waving maps. But in maritime Southeast Asia, power is often quieter. It's measured in nautical miles, hydrocarbon blocks, and fisheries enforcement patrols. Indonesia's position is actually disciplined. No territorial claim. Clear recognition of Malaysian sovereignty over Sabah. Commitment to legal frameworks, including ICJ rulings and UNCLOS mechanisms. But at the same time, intense sensitivity to maritime geometry. Sabah's proximity matters because it shapes Indonesia's EEZ calculations. It affects where Indonesian patrol boats sail, where fishing vessels operate, where potential offshore energy concessions can be granted. So when we ask, does Indonesia have a claim? The honest answer is no. Not territorially, not legally, not diplomatically. But does Indonesia have interests tied to Sabah's geographic position? Absolutely. And those interests are maritime, not territorial. That distinction isn't semantic, it's structural. One is about sovereignty over land. The other is about managing shared seas in one of the most strategically dense maritime corridors in the Indo-Pacific. Indonesia's stake isn't about owning Sabah. It's about ensuring that what happens along Sabah's coast doesn't compromise Indonesia's own maritime domain. That's a very different kind of leverage and a very different kind of calculation. If you stand in Jakarta and look north, Sabah isn't some distant political abstraction. It sits right across a maritime corridor that Indonesia cannot afford to ignore. The sea boundary in that sector stretches more than 1,000 kilometers. And this isn't a fenced land border with checkpoints and guard posts. It's open water. Wind, currents, fishing fleets, small cargo vessels. Beautiful, but porous. For years, that porosity created problems. Smuggling routes ran through it. Human trafficking networks exploited it. Illicit arms moved quietly between islands. The geography made enforcement hard, and non-state actors knew it. Then came the kidnappings. Between 2016 and 2018, militants linked to Abu Sayyaf carried out abductions in and around Sabah waters. Dozens of Indonesian sailors were taken hostage in cross-border attacks. These were tugboat crews and fishermen, not soldiers. Watching those headlines at the time, you could feel the anxiety building inside Indonesia. It wasn't theoretical, it was immediate. Citizens were being pulled off boats. That's when the security logic sharpened. In 2017, Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines launched coordinated trilateral maritime patrols, widely known as INDOMALPHI. The goal was simple: close the gaps, share intelligence, increase naval and air presence, make it harder for armed groups to exploit jurisdictional seams. And it worked. According to recap reporting, piracy and kidnapping incidents in the Sulu, Celebes Seas dropped sharply after coordinated patrols intensified. The sea lanes didn't become perfectly safe overnight, but the difference was measurable. That's the key implication. Stability in Sabah directly affects Indonesian national security. Not symbolically. Operationally. Sabah isn't a distant diplomatic talking point for Jakarta. It's part of the same maritime ecosystem that touches eastern Kalimantan and Sulawesi. When instability grows there, Indonesia absorbs the shock. Security is only one layer. The deeper layer is people. Estimates suggest between 300,000 and 800,000 Indonesians live in Sabah, both documented and undocumented. That's not a small migrant community. That's one of the largest concentrations of Indonesian workers abroad. They work in palm oil plantations. Construction. Fisheries. Some of the hardest and least visible jobs in Sabah's economy are done by Indonesian labor. And the money flows back. Remittances from Malaysia contribute billions of dollars annually to Indonesia's economy. For certain provinces in eastern Indonesia, those transfers are not marginal. They are lifelines. Families depend on them. Local economies factor them in. Sabah's stability, then, is directly tied to Indonesian labor welfare. If there is unrest, mass deportations, or economic contraction in Sabah, Jakarta feels it almost immediately, socially and economically. There's also the cross-border economy that doesn't always show up neatly in customs data. Tawau in Sabah and Nunukan in Indonesia have long been linked by trade flows that predate modern enforcement systems. Informal economic integration existed long before bureaucracies tried to regulate it. Boats move daily. Goods move daily. The rhythm is older than the paperwork. You can't switch that off without consequences. Indonesia also views the issue through a doctrinal lens. For decades, Jakarta has positioned itself as ASEAN de facto anchor state. Its foreign policy doctrine, famously described as bebas dan aktif, free and active, emphasizes territorial integrity, non-interference, and peaceful dispute settlement. Reopening or revisiting Sabah's sovereignty would contradict Indonesia's own foundational principles. It would weaken the very norm Jakarta relies on to defend its own territorial cohesion. And this is where the contrast with the Philippines becomes striking. The Philippines maintains a dormant but formal claim to Sabah rooted in the Sulu Sultanate. Indonesia does not. Manila's exposure is political and historical. Indonesia's exposure is material. Indonesia has a massive migrant population in Sabah. It faces high security spillover risk. Its maritime calculations are directly affected. In many ways, Indonesia has greater practical exposure to Sabah than the Philippines, but far less incentive to challenge sovereignty. That's not a weakness. That's structural logic. Hypothetically, yes, but only under extreme conditions. If Sabah experienced major internal instability. If Malaysia-Philippines tensions escalated dramatically. If maritime boundary disputes spiraled into sustained confrontation. Even then, escalation would run against Indonesia's core interests. Indonesia's archipelagic doctrine depends on the sanctity of inherited borders. Undermining that principle would set uncomfortable precedents, especially when Jakarta is already sensitive about peripheral regions like Papua. There's also hard economics. Bilateral trade between Indonesia and Malaysia exceeds $20 billion annually. The relationship is dense, layered, and mutually dependent. Risking that over a territory Indonesia has never legally claimed would contradict Jakarta's strategic culture. Structurally, escalation is unlikely. Indonesia is best understood as a silent stakeholder. Its interests in Sabah operate across three domains: security exposure, labor migration and remittance flows, maritime boundary stability. Sabah is not an irredentist cause for Indonesia. There are no mass movements demanding annexation, no official maps shading it red. But it is a strategic buffer zone critical to eastern Indonesian security. That's the nuance people often miss. The conclusion, when stripped of drama, is precise. Indonesia does not possess a legal or historical sovereignty claim to Sabah. It has never formally asserted one. It recognizes the Malaysian administration. But Indonesia has tangible strategic stakes, security, demographic, and maritime, that make it an indispensable secondary actor in any Sabah-related instability. In other words, Indonesia may not claim Sabah, but Sabah unquestionably shapes Indonesia's security calculus.
If you found this analysis valuable, share your perspective in the comments. Your insights help deepen the conversation and sharpen our understanding of evolving regional dynamics. Thank you, and we will see you soon in our next geopolitical discussion.
Sebahagian daripada Persekutuan Malaysia, izinkan saya Farafis sebagai antara yang menubuhkan Persekutuan Malaysia.
Selama sejak merdeka 58 tahun ini, terlalu ramai pemimpin-pemimpin Sabah dan Sarawak. Pemimpin silih berganti, ketua silih berganti, tetapi membunggah kekayaan yang luar biasa.
The flag is more than colored cloth. It is the ultimate emblem of identity and sovereignty. And in Sabah, it carries exceptional emotional and political weight. Sabah's own story shows why. 3 official state flags since 1963 chart a long negotiation between federal unity and local pride. In a hypothetical referendum today, those histories and identities would collide in a vivid test of belonging. The Malaysian national flag, Jalur Gemilang, would symbolize national integration and federal loyalty, appealing to those who prize security, economic stability, and the protection Malaysia provides against external claims like the Sulu Sultanate dispute. Its core supporters would likely be federal civil servants, citizens benefiting from national subsidies, and voters who see the Federation as the best guarantee of peace and prosperity. The current Sabah state flag, the Sembilan Bintang, would embody Sabahan First sentiment and the drive for greater autonomy. Its Mount Kinabalu motif and blue shades signaling unity and peace rooted in local heritage. It would rally indigenous communities, urban middle-class nationalists, and those demanding full implementation of the Malaysia Agreement 1963, especially amid grievances that Sabah's resources enrich the Federation more than the state itself. Historical or separatist flags would capture a small but passionate vote, whether for the 1963 Old Glory, which evokes the original terms of union, or for entirely new designs proposed by online secessionists. These symbols resonate with people who feel the federal project has eroded Sabah's original rights, and who flirt with outright independence despite serious security and diplomatic risks. Geopolitics and identity politics would shape the final choice. The referendum would pit Malaysia's nation-building narrative against a resurgent Sabahan nationalism, while economic calculations, federal subsidies versus local resource control, add another layer. The ever-present Philippine claim to Sabah would weigh heavily, nudging many voters towards solutions that stay within Malaysia's security umbrella. The likely outcome? A plurality for the Sembilan Bintang flag, reflecting strong popular demand for greater autonomy under MA 63, balanced by a substantial vote for the Jalur Gemilang. More than a decision about fabric, such a result would reveal Sabah's evolving identity, seeking deeper self-rule while remaining anchored to the Malaysian Federation. For a substantial portion of Sabah's electorate, Malaysia's red-blue-yellow Jalur Gemilang represents far more than a decorative emblem. It is the living pledge of national unity, security, and economic well-being. This attachment is anchored first in demography and policy. Roughly 67.6% of Sabah's population are Bumiputra, Kadazan Dusun, Bajau, Marut, and other indigenous groups, whose social and economic prospects are interwoven with federal affirmative action programs such as preferential university admissions, small business grants, and subsidized housing. Nationwide opinion data echo this trust in the Federation. An IRI public opinion survey in 2022 found that 67% of Malaysians believe the country was heading in the right direction, offering a broad, if indirect benchmark for Sabahans who see their own future tied to Malaysia's.
Security considerations give the Jalur Gemilang an equally powerful appeal. Sabah's accession to Malaysia in 1963 was shaped by the Cobbled Commission's emphasis on collective defense, and those arguments remain vivid today. Chinese maritime incursions in the South China Sea and the lingering territorial claim by the Sulu Sultanate, which Manila occasionally invokes, reinforce the sense that Sabah's best guarantee of territorial integrity lies in the Malaysian Federation's armed forces, Coast Guard, and diplomatic clout. Federal troop deployments, coast watch stations, and intelligence sharing all signal that protection is inseparable from the national flag. Economic interdependence strengthens this loyalty. Billions of ringgit in federal investment, major road and port upgrades, subsidies on rice, fuel, and electricity, nationwide healthcare and disaster relief funds regularly reach the state, reminding voters that daily prosperity and long-term resilience flow from Kuala Lumpur's coffers. National stimulus spending after the pandemic, as well as quick federal aid following Typhoon Nalgai and other storms, provided tangible proof that Sabah's welfare is bound to Malaysia's fiscal capacity. The result is a durable, pro-federation voting bloc. Federal civil servants and their families, members of the security forces, business owners dependent on nationwide subsidies and markets, and rural communities that rely on subsidized staples and healthcare. For these Sabahans, casting a ballot for the Jalur Gemilang in any future referendum would not merely affirm patriotic feeling. It would be a conscious choice for political stability, economic continuity, and guaranteed defense. In their view, the Malaysian national flag is both the emotional symbol of belonging and the practical shield ensuring that Sabah remains securely anchored in a larger, more protective nation. The Sembilan Bintang, 9 points, flag, formally adopted in 1988, is far more than a colorful banner. It is the distilled emblem of Sabahan First pride and identity. Its 2 bands of zircon blue, peace, and icicle blue, unity, frame a stylized silhouette of Mount Kinabalu, the highest peak in Southeast Asia and the spiritual heartland of the Kadazan Dusun people, who account for roughly 19.3% of Sabah's population. To many residents, this mountain represents the unbroken link between land, culture, and ancestry. By placing Kinabalu at the center of the design, the flag asserts that Sabah's heritage and political voice deserve recognition within, yet distinct from, the Malaysian Federation. That cultural symbolism has become inseparable from Sabah's modern political struggle for autonomy. The Malaysia Agreement 1963, MA63, which brought Sabah and Sarawak into Malaysia, promised wide self-government and an equitable share of resource revenues. Yet decades of centralized control have left many Sabahans feeling shortchanged despite abundant oil and gas wealth. Politicians and civil society leaders increasingly argue that true development, better roads, modern schools, and jobs that keep young people at home requires local control over taxes and natural resources. Flying the Sembilan Bintang has thus evolved into a visible demand to honor MA63, a way to insist that Kuala Lumpur respect the state's original rights and dignity. This dual meaning, cultural pride fused with political demand, shapes the Sembilan Bintang's strongest base of support. Its natural constituency includes local nationalists, urban middle-class voters frustrated by uneven development, and indigenous groups seeking stronger cultural recognition and fair economic participation. Grassroots organizations, student movements, and church and village leaders frequently rally around the flag at festivals and autonomy marches, transforming it into a living petition for fair treatment. Even many Sabahans who value the national union now view the Sembilan Bintang as the rightful everyday flag of their state, a declaration that Sabah's identity is neither a province of Kuala Lumpur nor a mere afterthought in Malaysian politics. A third, more emotionally charged and less mainstream camp in any Sabah flag referendum would rally around historical emblems or outright separatist banners, each carrying its own story of unfinished nation building,
political grievance, and long-suppressed aspirations. Though far smaller than the blocs favoring either the Malaysian national flag or the current Sembilan Bintang, these options speak to enduring debates about how Sabah joined Malaysia and how that union has evolved.
Kita telah minta tindakan segera. Bukan saja PEN Borneo yang perlu diselesaikan, tetapi juga jalan-jalan yang rosak. Kita sudah minta tindakan segera, dan saya percaya rakan-rakan kerajaan negeri, sebahagiannya kita serahkan sepenuhnya kepada kerajaan negeri, sebahagiannya ikut peraturan biasa keuangan, dan saya ingin memberi jaminan bahawa ini kerajaan perpaduan yang serius dan kita bertekad untuk menyelesaikan masalah ini dalam keadaan yang segera.
The best-known historical choice is the 1963 to 1981 Old Glory flag, a striking design of a blue upper field over red with a white canton. This was the flag that flew when Sabah entered the Malaysian Federation in 1963 under the Malaysia Agreement, MA63, which envisioned Sabah, Sarawak, and Malaya as equal partners with extensive autonomy over immigration, natural resources, and taxation. Over the decades, constitutional amendments and expanding federal powers eroded those guarantees. Supporters of Old Glory view its revival as a political reset button, a call to reclaim the true federalism originally promised. In their eyes, raising the old flag would pressure Kuala Lumpur to honor long-delayed commitments on revenue sharing and self-government, making it both a historical homage and a contemporary political demand. A smaller but more radical faction would go further, questioning Sabah's place in Malaysia altogether. Some nostalgically point to the British North Borneo flag, the emblem of Sabah under colonial administration, as a neutral starting point for reimagining sovereignty. Others propose entirely new separatist designs, stylized versions of the state crest or modern minimalist symbols that would proclaim outright independence. These groups are driven by deep economic grievances. Despite contributing billions in oil and gas revenues, Sabah remains among Malaysia's least developed states. They also invoke the perceived failure of MA63, arguing that Sabah never truly received the autonomy it bargained for. Online forums and community discussions sometimes echo bold claims that Sabah can stand on its own 2 feet, citing rich natural resources and a strategic location astride key global shipping lanes. One widely shared comment captures their sentiment. Malaysia's rot of centralization and corruption leaves independence as the only path to honest governance and equitable growth. Despite the passion of these voices, serious geopolitical and security hurdles remain. The Philippines continues to assert a historical claim to Sabah, a dispute reignited in 2022 by an international arbitration award of roughly US $15 billion to heirs of the Sulu Sultanate. Any secessionist move would likely intensify this claim and invite other external pressures, making independence a high-risk gamble. Together, these historical and separatist flag options form a symbolic minority current, a reminder of Sabah's complex colonial past and of the discontent that lingers when promised autonomy is delayed. While unlikely to command a majority, their presence in a referendum would test the depth of Sabah's attachment to Malaysia, signaling unresolved questions about identity, governance, and the meaning of the 1963 pact that created the modern Malaysian Federation. Yet the leap from rhetoric to reality is formidable. Geopolitical risks loom large. Foremost, the Sulu Sultanate's dormant but legally persistent claim to Sabah. This claim flared in 2022 when a European arbitration court awarded roughly $15 billion to heirs of the Sulu royal family. A ruling that, while unenforceable in Malaysia, underscores the legal and diplomatic headaches independence could invite. A standalone Sabah could also become a magnet for great power rivalry, with neighboring states and outside powers vying for influence in a territory sitting astride major sea routes and rich hydrocarbon fields. The absence of a strong national defense force would leave a breakaway Sabah vulnerable to external interference and internal instability, especially in a region already riven by piracy and transnational crime. The core support for these historical or separatist flags remains small compared with those favoring either the Malaysian Jalur Gemilang or the current Sabah state flag. It consists mainly of hardcore autonomists, secession activists, and citizens with long memories of federal neglect. including some younger Sabahans inspired by global movements for self-determination. While these groups would struggle to win a majority, their activism would shape the political debate, keeping alive issues of historical justice, revenue rights, and genuine autonomy. In a hypothetical referendum, these historical or separatist flags would almost certainly finish behind the Malaysian national flag and the current Sabah flag. But their symbolic power is significant. They would act as a constant reminder that, for many Sabahans, the story of federation remains unfinished, and that questions of sovereignty, fairness, and identity are far from settled. A referendum on Sabah's flag would ultimately go far beyond the surface question of colors and emblems. It would crystallize a deeper debate over federalism, autonomy, and identity that has defined East Malaysia's relationship with the Federation since 1963. Voters would not simply be choosing a banner, they would be signaling how they see Sabah's place within Malaysia, and how strongly they wish to reclaim the political and economic promises of the Malaysia Agreement 1963, MA63. The most likely outcome is that the current Sabah state flag, the Sembilan Bintang, would win a plurality rather than an overwhelming mandate. Its Mount Kinabalu emblem and Sabahan first meaning align with growing calls for greater autonomy and fairer resource control, making it the natural vessel for local pride and the push to fully implement MA63. Yet a large, resilient minority would still back the Malaysian national flag, the Jalur Gemilang, reflecting the enduring appeal of national unity, federal subsidies, and security guarantees. This split verdict would speak volumes. Sabahans are seeking more room to steer their own future while remaining within Malaysia's protective embrace. The vote, in short, would not settle the question of identity but illuminate it, showing a society determined to balance local empowerment with national cohesion in an era of shifting geopolitics and rising regional stakes. If you like the video, do not forget to like, share, and subscribe our channel for deep analysis of contemporary issues. It starts with Sabah, a lingering wound in Southeast Asian geopolitics. Long claimed by the Philippine dispute has flared up again. In 2025, President Marcos Jr. reignited the claim, echoing Duterte's words, "Sabah is ours."
To assert our territorial rights, it's not a claim, it is already our territorial right.
That is historical. Malaysia fired back. PM Anwar Ibrahim declared, "Sabah will never be part of the Philippines. This is Malaysian territory. Full stop." But this is no longer just about history. Sabah is now part of a larger power game, the South China Sea standoff. Both nations face Chinese encroachment, but their strategies couldn't be more different. The Philippines is loud and assertive. After aggressive Chinese actions near Second Thomas Shoal, Manila doubled down. Under the Re-Horizon 3 strategy, it shifted focus from insurgency to external defense. Massive joint drills, new missile systems, and defense ties with the US, Japan, and Australia are pushing rapid military modernization. Malaysia, by contrast, remains quiet but cautious. It avoids public confrontations, even after incursions into its exclusive economic zone. Instead, it builds strength behind the scenes, reinforcing East Malaysia, expanding surveillance, and focusing on flexible, force of the future doctrine. It drills near Sabah but avoids the spotlight. In capability terms, Malaysia leads in air power and submarines, while the Philippines excels in alliances and momentum. The Philippines fields more troops and ships, but many remain lightly equipped. Still, its modernization is accelerating and driven by public will. A 2025 poll showed 61% of Filipinos support stronger defense, even at the risk of conflict with China. In Malaysia, 57% prefer diplomacy to escalation. So, who has the better strategy? Is the Philippines being bold or overreaching? Is Malaysia's silence wise or risky? And with Sabah back in the spotlight, could this historical dispute turn into Southeast Asia's next flashpoint? As China tightens its grip, smaller powers must choose resist loudly or endure silently. theme of Indo-Pacific geopolitics, money is muscle. And in 2025, both the Philippines and Malaysia have opened their wallets wider, but are they spending smart or simply spending more? Let's start with the Philippines, where defense has become not just a national security issue, but a matter of national identity. The 2025 approved budget for the Department of National Defense stands at a record-breaking 271.9 billion Filipino pesos, approx. 4.65 billion US dollars, a 12.3% increase from 2024. On paper, that's impressive. But dig deeper, and the cracks start to show. Out of this amount, the Army claims 138.2 billion Filipino pesos, followed by the Air Force with 51.6 billion Filipino pesos, and the Navy close behind at 51 billion Filipino pesos. That means land-based operations still dominate spending, despite the country's growing maritime threats in the West Philippine Sea. But here's the kicker. Only 35 billion Filipino pesos, $595 million, is guaranteed for the Military Modernization Fund, a drop from the expected 50 billion Filipino pesos. Another 40 billion Filipino pesos, 680 million US dollars, is marked as unprogrammed, meaning it will only materialize if there are surplus government revenues. As one defense analyst sarcastically put it, you can't defend the Spratlys with if funds allow. This raises serious questions. Is 595 million US dollars enough for a military trying to transform itself into a world-class force while directly facing off against China's maritime militia and Coast Guard? And does the reliance on unprogrammed funds suggest that modernization is more of a political slogan than a sustained national priority? For all the rhetoric, some observers are skeptical. The ambition is huge. The funding? Not so much. Meanwhile, Malaysia's 2025 defense budget stands at US 4.8 billion, a noticeable bump from US 4.37 billion in 2024. Of this, 1.3 billion US dollars is specifically set aside for maintenance, repairs, and procurement of new military assets. The country's defense spending trajectory looks solid, with an expected 8.4% compound annual growth rate, CAGR, potentially reaching 6.2 billion US dollars by 2028. On paper, this sounds like a methodical upward trend, precisely what you'd want for long-term defense planning. But there's a catch. Malaysia's procurement system has long been haunted by scandal, from the controversial Scorpion submarine deal to more recent reports of overpriced and underdelivered assets. Trust in how Malaysia spends its defense budget remains shaky. As one Kuala Lumpur-based analyst remarked in a 2025 defense roundtable, Malaysia's issue isn't money, it's what happens after the money's spent. So the debate here is equally sharp. Can Malaysia truly convert dollars into strength on the ground? Or at sea, if corruption and inefficiency remain unaddressed? Is a bigger budget actually meaningful if projects are delayed, canceled, or quietly swept under the rug? Unlike the Philippines, where the issue is underfunding, Malaysia's challenge is overpromising and underdelivering. Both countries then are racing against time, but on different tracks. The Philippines faces an immediate and growing external threat, but is stuck with limited guaranteed funds. Malaysia, meanwhile, has the budget and time, but struggles with internal accountability. It's like watching one soldier sprinting with a limp, and the other walking straight but tied to a weight. This brings us back to the key question. Does a bigger budget equal stronger defense? Or does real power come from how efficiently and honestly that budget is spent? When it comes to ground forces, the Philippines might appear as a land-power giant, boasting around 150,000 active troops and a staggering 1.2 million reserve force as of 2025. That's more than double Malaysia's active force. But here's the twist. Does quantity equal capability, especially in a 21st century battlefield dominated by technology, speed, and doctrine? The Philippine Army, PA, continues to carry the weight of a history deeply entrenched in counterinsurgency operations, shaped by decades of internal conflict against communist rebels and Islamist militants. As one anonymous defense expert bluntly puts it, The PA is trained to fight rebels in jungles, not divisions on open terrain or amphibious invasions. Even with modernization funds, this mindset is hard to pivot. In 2025, the Army is operating on a $2.4 billion budget, a significant share of the defense pie. But how it's being spent matters more than how much is allocated. On the ground, the PA is acquiring new tools for mobility and fire support. Deliveries of Bell 412 EPX aeromedical helicopters are ongoing, while the country recently received 10 out of 32 ordered S-70II Black Hawk helicopters, part of a deal signed in 2022. It's also fielding 12 Atmos 2,155mm self-propelled howitzers, purchased for $40.8 million, with plans to expand the fleet. These are important upgrades, but many question whether helicopter mobility and artillery alone can offset the structural legacy of a force not yet trained or equipped for large-scale, high-intensity warfare. Here's the critical question. Can a force that spent most of its existence chasing guerrillas in the mountains rapidly shift to defending reefs, islands, and supply lines against a heavily armed adversary like China? Or even in a regional flashpoint like Sabah? In an archipelagic setting, mobility is vital. But mobility without protection or firepower might just be a faster way to reach the battlefield and lose. Now flip the lens to Malaysia, where the Malaysian Army operates with 113,000 active personnel and around 51,600 reserves. Smaller in manpower, yes, but potentially leaner and more lethal. Kuala Lumpur is investing in a mechanized and armor-heavy doctrine, prioritizing firepower over numbers. Their acquisition of AW-1, 49 utility and combat search and rescue helicopters is part of a broader strategy, but the real punch comes from main battle tanks like the PT-91M, armored personnel carriers, and a more integrated ground maneuver force. In 2025, Malaysia has earmarked approximately $2.56 billion for defense procurement across all branches, and a notable portion is directed at the Army's mechanization. This is not just about upgrading, it's about redefining how wars are fought. As one analyst observed in a recent Kuala Lumpur security forum, Malaysia is building a force that can hold ground, not just chase threats. So here's the tactical trade-off. The Philippines has boots, Malaysia has armor. In a conventional land conflict, say a clash in Sabah or a joint defense scenario in East Malaysia, who has the upper hand? Does a larger infantry force with helicopter support beat out a smaller but heavily armored opponent? Or is the Philippines playing catch-up in a domain where it's still doctrinally outgunned? Let's not forget, in a limited land conflict, mobility and airlift capacity matter, but firepower, protection, and logistics often decide the outcome. The Philippines is trying to rewire its land doctrine while already on the clock. Malaysia, meanwhile, has built a force more aligned with conventional warfare, but with its own challenges in training, sustainment, and modernization speed. In a region where control of the seas defines sovereignty, the naval forces of the Philippines and Malaysia are both navigating turbulent waters. One chasing blue water dreams, the other struggling to keep its fleet afloat amid delays and dysfunction. The Philippine Navy, PN in 2025, is on the move, literally and symbolically. With a budget slice of $870 million and a growing fleet of 90 vessels, the PN ranks 30th globally, with a true value rating of 33.7, WDMMW 2025. The Navy's active personnel count sits at around 24,500, and while its warships aren't the most advanced, the emphasis on fleet size and presence reflects a serious shift in doctrine. As one recent YouTube analyst put it, the PN is signaling a decisive shift from coastal defense to credible deterrence in the increasingly volatile South China Sea. This isn't just rhetoric. The flagship acquisition for 2025 is the much-anticipated HDC 3100 Corvette BRP Miguel Malvar from Hyundai Heavy Industries, with another due in 2026. At the same time, the PN is overseeing the construction of 6 new offshore patrol vessels, expanding its ability to patrol its vast maritime territory. But perhaps the most buzzed-about headline, Manila is seriously considering buying at least 2 submarines. A US $1.5 billion leap that's drawing both applause and alarm. Critics aren't pulling punches. Procuring submarines without the support infrastructure, trained personnel, and long-term funding, that's how you build white elephants, not deterrence, warned one naval strategist in a 2025 defense forum. With only $595 million guaranteed for modernization this year, and submarine operations being some of the most resource-intensive in the world, the question arises, is the Philippines aiming for prestige at the cost of practicality? Let's not forget what the PN urgently needs is enhanced maritime domain awareness, fast patrol crafts, and coastal radar systems to counter China's daily gray zone incursions near 2nd Thomas Shoal and Sabina Shoal. As one Filipino naval officer bluntly told local media in April, "We don't need to hide underwater yet. We need to see what's above the surface first." On the other side of the Sulu Sea, the Royal Malaysian Navy, RMN, fields a smaller fleet, just 45 ships and ranks 32nd globally, with a true value rating of 25.7. But unlike the Philippines, Malaysia already owns 2 Scorpion-class submarines, operational since the late 2000s and has traditionally been viewed as the more technically advanced Navy. However, 2025 tells a very different story. The long-delayed Maharaja Lela-class littoral combat ship, LCS program has become Malaysia's naval embarrassment. Launched with much fanfare but plagued by cost overruns, corruption allegations, and mismanagement. The first ship, KD Maharaja Lela, was only 96.52% complete as of July 2025, despite being launched over a decade after the project began. The second vessel, KD Raja Muda Nala, was only just launched on July 3, 2025, years behind schedule. That delay has crippled fleet readiness, leaving RMN with high-tech assets that are still sitting in dry docks. So here's the debate. Malaysia has submarines and more sophisticated combat systems, but can you claim naval superiority if your most advanced platforms are years behind schedule and shrouded in scandal? You can't sail on corruption, a Malaysian opposition MP quipped earlier this year. And with most of RMN's active platforms dating back to the 1990s or early 2000s, fleet age and operational tempo are growing concerns. Meanwhile, the Philippines is playing catch-up, but arguably doing it with clearer priorities, getting affordable, multi-role ships in the water now, instead of betting everything on shiny flagship programs that might not float. Manila's fleet isn't elegant, but it's visible, expanding, and increasingly present in contested waters. That's something the RMN, despite its past reputation, is struggling to match. In an era where air superiority can tip the balance of power, the skies over Southeast Asia are becoming increasingly contested, and the Philippines and Malaysia are racing to modernize, but on very different trajectories. Let's start with the Philippine Air Force, PAF. With a 2025 budget of $890.5 million, the PAF is making strides, but is it enough? The most anticipated arrival? 12 brand new FA-50 Block 20 light fighters, set to double its supersonic fleet. Add to that 6 more A-29B Super Tucano light attack aircraft expected by 2026, and you have a force that's growing but still fundamentally limited. But the ambitions are bigger. Defense Secretary Gilberto Teodoro Jr. dropped a major hint in July 2025. We need tankers. We need sustainment. It's easy to buy, but the real challenge is maintaining these systems with adequate reserves and munitions. The Philippines is also eyeing airborne warning and control system, AWACS aircraft, and plans to acquire at least 40 multi-role fighter jets, with F-16s and Gripens on the table. The debate? All this sounds bold, but is it viable? Critics argue that light fighters and prop-driven attack aircraft may offer some air defense utility, but they're far from air superiority platforms in the face of modern threats from China or even regional adversaries. What good is a fighter without radar coverage or refueling support? One aviation analyst asked bluntly. And with modernization budgets still relying heavily on unprogrammed funds, is the MRF dream just talk? Switch over to Malaysia, and you get a more diverse but fragmented picture. The Royal Malaysian Air Force, RMAF, is expecting a wave of new gear between October 2025 and 2028, including FA-50 light combat aircraft, maritime patrol aircraft, MPAs, air defense radars, and new helicopters. But that's not all. Malaysia is also adding 3 Angka-S combat drones from Turkey, a move signaling serious investment in surveillance and unmanned capability. Plus, leasing up to 28 Leonardo helicopters, including the AW149, with deliveries starting in 2026. So what's the catch? Despite the variety, the RMAF faces a familiar enemy: fleet complexity. With a mix of Russian, American, European, and now Turkish systems, interoperability becomes a nightmare. Logistics, maintenance, and training pipelines are stretched thin. They're buying puzzle pieces from different games, a retired RMAF officer joked in a recent defense forum. Here's the core debate. Does Malaysia's diversified air strategy, blending manned jets, drones, and patrol assets, create practical adaptability? Or is it building a jack-of-all-trades, master of none force that risks fragmentation in real combat? In the high-stakes game of Indo-Pacific geopolitics, the Philippines and Malaysia aren't just upgrading weapons. They're making strategic bets on survival, sovereignty, and global alliances. South China Sea, 2 strategies, 1 pressure point. At the front lines of maritime tension, the Philippines is leaning hard into alliances. After years of gray zone confrontations with China, Manila has doubled down on military pacts, forging deeper ties with the US, Japan, Australia, South Korea, and even exploring links with France, Italy, and the UK. The game changer: plans for a US ammunition depot and factory in Subic. A stark signal that Western powers are back in force. Meanwhile, Malaysia is walking a tightrope, holding onto a diplomatic first posture, guided by UNCLOS principles and ASEAN solidarity. In a May 2025 press release, the Malaysian Foreign Ministry reiterated, Malaysia firmly holds the view that matters relating to the South China Sea must be resolved peacefully and constructively. Debate point: is Manila's alliance strategy a crucial shield against Chinese aggression, or a dangerous proxy trap that could drag the Philippines into a bigger war? Is Kuala Lumpur's non-aligned stance offering strategic flexibility or quietly ceding space in the face of incremental Chinese encroachment? Foreign aid versus independent procurement. On the hardware side, the Philippines is powered by US FMS, with ongoing support from Japan, South Korea, and Australia. Not just equipment, but joint patrols and war games. In contrast, Malaysia is diversifying, adding Turkish drones, Italian helicopters, and European systems to its arsenal. The approach? Strategic independence, but at the cost of interoperability headaches. Debate point: is the Philippines' dependency on external aid strategic realism, or a dangerous erosion of autonomy? And does Malaysia's mix-and-match procurement strategy enable true self-reliance, or create a patchwork force lacking synergy? Self-reliant defense posture. SRDP, rhetoric or reality? The Philippines passed its SRDP Revitalization Act in October 2024, an ambitious move toward local defense manufacturing, tech transfer, and homegrown industry. Malaysia, meanwhile, is pushing ASEAN defense collaboration and actively courting defense investments, as showcased at the ADMM Retreat 2025. But here's the burning question: can either country really build a viable defense industry from scratch under budget constraints and foreign tech restrictions? Or is SRDP more symbolic posturing than a tangible path to independence? As we close this Southeast Asian military face-off, one thing is clear: this isn't just about tanks, ships, or fighter jets. It's about political will, strategic clarity, and the sheer ability to adapt under pressure. Malaysia may hold the edge in conventional firepower today, built on years of consistent, if sometimes inefficient, defense spending, and a doctrine favoring mechanized, balanced forces. But its slow-moving procurement processes, plagued by scandals and delays, beg the question: is Malaysia still capable of turning spending into real strength? The Philippines, once focused almost entirely on counterinsurgency, is now in hyperdrive transformation mode, accelerating defense reform, forging powerful global alliances, and trying to close decades-old capability gaps in just a few years. Yet it still struggles with limited guaranteed modernization funds, doctrinal inertia, and an urgent need to train for external threats in a hostile maritime domain. Debate point. Will Manila's rapid alliance-fueled pivot finally create a credible deterrent against regional threats like China, or burnout due to political turnover, budget shortfalls, and strategic overstretch? Will Malaysia's steady, self-reliant doctrine win in the long run, or is it quietly falling behind in a region that rewards speed, adaptability, and partnerships? The future? The real contest isn't Philippines versus Malaysia, it's ambition versus execution. Both countries talk of modernization, deterrence, and sovereignty. But only those who back words with sustained funding, integrated strategy, and institutional discipline will truly shape the balance of power in the Indo-Pacific. Thank you for tuning into our channel. If you enjoyed the video, please remember to like, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more in-depth analysis of global issues.
Where police shot dead 14 farmers in Negros Island on Sunday.
A former Philippine police official is sued by two whistleblowers who are now being accused as the masterminds.
From Manila to Los Angeles, San Francisco to Davao, welcome back! Remember in our last video, we talked about how rural farming communities in the Philippines are fighting against land grabs and militarization, and how heartbreaking it was when another Lumad school was forced to close? Well, today's story takes that same thread, but cranks it up to a shocking new level. Because just as the Philippines is proudly hosting a big regional summit on international humanitarian law, basically a conference where officials stand on stage and talk about peace, rights, and justice, Malaysia, through the group Pan-Asia-Pacific, has dropped a bombshell. They've named the Philippines the most dangerous country in all of Asia for farmers, indigenous peoples, and land activists. Let that sink in. While our leaders pose for cameras and give speeches about protecting human rights, the numbers on the ground are telling a very different story. According to PANAP, in 2024, there were 6 land-related killings in the Philippines, claiming 9 victims. On top of that, they documented 10 cases of arrests and legal harassment involving 41 people, and 9 separate incidents of threats and physical assault that left 11 more victims living in fear. These aren't abstract statistics, these are fathers, mothers, community leaders, and farmers who simply wanted to protect their land and livelihood. One case that really cuts deep is that of Juan Sumilhig, a Maranao farmer and former political detainee who was reportedly killed by soldiers from the Philippine Army's 4th Infantry Battalion in San Jose. Imagine that! A man who should have been safeguarded under international humanitarian law became another casualty, his name added to a growing list of silenced voices. And yet here we are, listening to official speeches that paint the Philippines as a champion of human rights, while communities on the ground are left vulnerable, harassed, and grieving. This is the regional irony Malaysia is pointing out. It's not just about calling out the Philippines on the global stage, it's about holding a mirror to the contradiction between polished rhetoric and brutal realities. And for us, whether you're watching in Quezon City or New York, this hits close to home. Because these aren't faceless numbers, there are kababayans, our relatives in Mindanao, our indigenous brothers and sisters, our farmers who put food on the table. So today, we're going to unpack why Malaysia and groups like PANAP are sounding the alarm, what it says about the Philippines' credibility when it comes to human rights, and most importantly, why we can't afford to ignore these stories. Stay tuned, because this is not just a headline, this is a wake-up call. After we set the stage with that shocking irony, the Philippines hosting a regional human rights summit, while being called out as Asia's most dangerous place for farmers and indigenous peoples, let's dive deeper into why Malaysia is raising the alarm. Through the Malaysia-based NGO, Pan-Asia-Pacific, or PANAP, the numbers paint a disturbing picture of reality in the Philippines. In just 2024, 6 violent incidents tied to land conflicts left 9 people dead. That statistic alone is chilling. But when you zoom out, it gets even more alarming. The Philippines now ranks 2nd in the entire world for land defender killings, right behind Mexico. Imagine that. For a country that prides itself on democratic values, it is being counted among the deadliest nations for those who simply want to protect their homes and their land. But killings are not the whole story. PANAP recorded 41 individuals who faced arrest or detention because of their role in land struggles. These are people dragged through the legal system, often on trumped-up charges, just because they dared to resist displacement or defend ancestral land. On top of that, another 11 victims were documented as targets of harassment, threats, or outright physical assault. Each one of those numbers represents a human being, a mother, a father, a young activist, whose life has been disrupted or destroyed. And then there's the story PANAP chose to highlight as a case study. Juan Sumilhig, an indigenous Maranao farmer. He wasn't just tilling the soil for his family's survival. He was also a man who had already endured political detention in the past. According to reports, he was allegedly killed by soldiers from the Philippine Army's 4th Infantry Battalion in San Jose. Think about that. Someone who should have been protected under international humanitarian law instead became another casualty of militarization. His death isn't just one statistic in PANAP's report. It's a symbol of how vulnerable rural and indigenous communities are when caught between state forces and land disputes. Malaysia's concern here isn't only about counting the dead and the detained, it's about exposing the contradictions. PANAP's deputy director, Arnold Padilla, didn't mince words. He warned that the Philippines cannot claim to be a regional human rights leader while allowing these abuses to continue. For him, the hypocrisy is glaring. On one side, government officials host international conferences on peace and law, but on the other, farmers and land defenders are red-tagged, militarized, and criminalized at home.
And this is where Malaysia's messaging cuts deep. They are framing the Philippines not as a safe place for dialogue and rights, but as a danger zone, a country where standing up for your land can put a literal target on your back. For PANAP and its supporters, the Philippines has become the cautionary tale of how official rhetoric can mask a darker reality, one where rural communities live with fear every day. When we talk about Malaysia and the Philippines, we're not just talking about two neighbors separated by the Sulu Sea, we're talking about countries bound by history, culture, and sometimes conflict. Both nations carry the scars of colonial legacies, with indigenous and Muslim communities who have long fought for autonomy and recognition. And of course, there's the lingering tension over Sabah, a land claim that has often flared up and colored diplomatic ties. Yet despite these disputes, Malaysia has also played a key role as a peace partner, most notably in facilitating the Moro peace talks that brought some hope for Mindanao. In other words, Malaysia has walked a fine line, sometimes standing as a brother in dialogue, sometimes standing as a wary neighbor watching instability spill over its borders. But here's where human rights abuses inside the Philippines complicate everything. Malaysia isn't just looking at these killings of farmers and indigenous leaders as isolated tragedies. They see them as destabilizing factors that ripple outwards, fueling unrest in Mindanao, threatening to spill across the sea, and stirring unease in places like Sabah. From Malaysia's perspective, every assassination of a land defender, every militarized crackdown, isn't just the Philippines' internal problem, it's a regional security concern. And this is where bilateral trust begins to fray. Malaysia wants stability along its border, but when it sees persistent violence in the rural Philippines, that trust takes a hit. Cross-border security has already been tested before, with insurgent groups spilling over into Sabah, sparking deadly standoffs and displacement. Add to that the red tagging and militarization of indigenous communities in Mindanao, and Malaysia fears that instability could once again seep across the frontier.
There's also the ASEAN dimension. Malaysia, like the Philippines, wants to be seen as a credible advocate of humanitarian values on the regional stage. But when Kuala Lumpur highlights the Philippines' worsening human rights record, it's essentially saying, how can you claim leadership in ASEAN human rights initiatives when your own farmers, your own lumad, your own activists aren't safe at home? That kind of messaging adds another layer of pressure. Not just government to government, but reputation to reputation within ASEAN itself. So in the shadow of rights abuses, Malaysia-Philippines relations remain complicated. They are tied together by history, by shared struggles, and by geographic fate. But every new case of violence against indigenous peoples and land defenders doesn't just hurt communities in the Philippines, it strains trust with Malaysia, raises security alarms across borders, and chips away at the credibility both countries want to project in Southeast Asia. Now here's where the contradiction really shows itself. Under President Ferdinand Marcos Jr., the Philippines has been working hard to polish its image as a regional champion of human rights. Hosting international conferences on international humanitarian law, IHL, is part of that strategy. It's meant to signal to ASEAN and the world that the country is serious about peace, about law, and about protecting vulnerable communities. On paper, that sounds powerful. But on the ground, Malaysia, through groups like PANAP, is saying something very different. Because while the speeches are being made in hotel conference halls, rural communities are living through a much harsher reality. Bombings, extrajudicial killings, red tagging, and harassment. These aren't isolated cases. They've become a pattern. Malaysia points to this gap between glossy rhetoric and brutal reality and says, this isn't just a domestic issue, it's a regional concern. For them, it's not only about human rights, it's about credibility. And that credibility matters deeply in ASEAN. If the Philippines is projecting itself as a leader in humanitarian law, while its own indigenous peoples and farmers are being silenced and killed, it risks dragging down ASEAN's entire standing in global human rights discussions. After all, how can the bloc push for humanitarian credibility on the world stage if one of its key members is being called out as Asia's deadliest country for land defenders? It also complicates regional initiatives that Malaysia, the Philippines, and other ASEAN states often work on together, especially when it comes to indigenous rights, rural advocacy, and cross-border peace building. For Malaysia, the contradiction is not just ironic, it's dangerous. Because if the Philippines' message is seen as hollow, it weakens ASEAN's collective voice and undermines cooperation on the very issues these conferences are supposed to strengthen. So while Marcos Jr.'s government is eager to be seen as a protector of human rights in Asia, Malaysia is reminding the world of a sobering truth. Without real changes on the ground, all those speeches and conferences risk becoming nothing more than political theater. When Malaysia, through PANAP, shines a spotlight on the Philippines' human rights abuses, it's not just about calling out a neighbor. It's also about positioning itself in the region. By exposing what's happening on the ground in Mindanao and across rural communities, Malaysia is quietly asserting its own leadership in human rights advocacy within Asia. In many ways, it's saying, if the Philippines claims to be a champion of humanitarian law, then why are its indigenous peoples, farmers, and activists paying with their lives? That narrative not only weakens the Philippines' credibility, it creates an opening for Malaysia to step into the role of the region's more consistent human rights voice. But Malaysia's motives aren't just about prestige, they're also about pressure. By keeping the Philippines under scrutiny, Malaysia hopes to push the government to deal with the root causes of rural insurgency. Because let's be honest, the conflict in Mindanao isn't just about ideology. It's deeply tied to land struggles, indigenous rights, and the lack of protection for communities under threat. From Malaysia's perspective, if these issues aren't resolved, instability in the southern Philippines will continue to spill across borders. Every case of displacement, every act of militarization, risks becoming a cross-border problem for Sabah and beyond. So this isn't just moral outrage. It's also a strategic push to get Manila to clean its own house for the sake of regional stability. And then there's the peace dimension. Malaysia has long been a mediator in the Mindanao peace process, hosting and facilitating talks between the Philippine government and Moro rebel groups. That role has earned Malaysia credibility as a neutral broker. But land rights and indigenous struggles are at the heart of that conflict. So when Malaysia highlights abuses in the Philippines, it's also reinforcing its own relevance as a mediator. It's essentially saying, we're not just bystanders in this story. We've been part of building peace in Mindanao, and we'll keep holding our neighbor accountable so that peace has a fighting chance. So when you connect the dots, Malaysia's exposure of Philippine abuses works on multiple levels. It asserts leadership, it applies pressure for real reforms, and it strengthens its own hand as a peace broker in a conflict that affects the entire region. For Malaysia, this isn't just about criticizing the Philippines. It's about shaping the regional narrative on human rights, stability, and peace. And so, when we step back and look at the bigger picture, the Philippines becomes more than just a country struggling with its own land conflicts. It becomes a regional mirror. For Malaysia, it's a cautionary tale of what happens when land struggles are left unresolved. They turn deadly, they destabilize communities, and sooner or later, they invite international scrutiny. Think about the irony. On August 17, 2025, as the Philippines proudly hosted a regional human rights conference on international humanitarian law, PANAP released its findings branding the country as the deadliest in Asia for farmers, indigenous peoples, and land activists. 6 killings in 2024, 9 victims in total, 10 cases of arrests and detentions involving 41 people. 9 incidents of threats, harassment, and physical assault with 11 more victims. And let's not forget the global ranking, second only to Mexico in land defender killings. These are not just statistics, they are lives lost, families broken, and communities terrorized. Arnold Padilla, PANAP's deputy director, put it bluntly, while the Marcos Jr. administration is busy projecting itself as a champion of human rights by hosting conferences, the reality on the ground tells a much darker story. Farmers, farm workers, indigenous peoples, and their advocates are being red-tagged, bombed, harassed, and even killed. Padilla warned that international humanitarian law clearly prohibits the bombings, indiscriminate gunfire, and civilian killings that the Philippine military has been accused of carrying out. Yet the red tagging of activists blurs the line between civilian and combatant, making it easier to justify abuses in the name of counterinsurgency. For Malaysia, this contradiction is more than just hypocrisy, it's a regional liability. It undermines ASEAN's credibility when the Philippines positions itself as a voice for human rights abroad, but fails to protect its own people at home. It complicates joint initiatives on indigenous and rural rights, and it erodes the trust needed for effective regional cooperation. At the heart of it, this is about image and reality. The image of the Philippines as a democratic, rights-respecting nation versus the reality of farmers and indigenous leaders living in fear of militarization and persecution. Until those two are reconciled, the Philippines will remain, in Malaysia's eyes, not a model of leadership, but a warning. A reminder that without justice at home, human rights rhetoric abroad rings hollow. And that's the hard truth. The Philippines today is being branded not as Asia's human rights champion, but as Asia's most dangerous country for those who dare to defend land, life, and dignity.
If you liked the video, do not forget to like, share, and subscribe our channel for deep analysis of contemporary issues. Nations, one land, and a question that refuses to die: was Sabah merely leased or permanently surrendered? For more than a century, that single question has haunted Southeast Asia, fueling one of its most sensitive and explosive territorial disputes. Today, the guns are silent, but the legal battles rage on. Heirs of the once powerful Sultanate of Sulu are fighting for billions in compensation. Diplomats exchange sharp notes behind closed doors. And Sabah, known for its rich natural resources and strategic location, stands right in the middle of a high-stakes political firestorm. Will the Philippines ever reclaim what many believe was never truly given away? Or will Malaysia, backed by years of effective control and international recognition, continue to assert its authority over the land? What makes this more than just a historical argument is the sheer scale of the consequences. Identity, sovereignty, oil, and influence all hang in the balance. And here's the twist. Malaysia still pays a yearly sum to the heirs of the Sulu Sultanate. If they truly own Sabah, why keep paying? In 2022, a European arbitration court shocked the world by siding with the Sulu heirs, ordering Malaysia to pay a staggering $14.9 billion. Suddenly, a forgotten colonial-era document signed in 1878 became front-page news again. This isn't just a land dispute, it's a geopolitical drama woven with colonial legacies, legal gray zones, and rising regional tension. In this video, we'll dive deep into the history, expose the legal battles, explore the emotional weight of the claim,
and reveal why Sabah remains a ticking time bomb in ASEAN diplomacy. So we ask you, should the Philippines time to close this chapter and move on? To understand the heart of the Sabah dispute, we must travel back over 300 years to a time of sultans, revolts, and royal favors. In 1704, the Sultan of Brunei, in gratitude for military assistance during a rebellion, granted the territory of Sabah, then North Borneo, to the Sultan of Sulu. This wasn't just a thank you note, it was a royal cession of land, setting the foundation for the Philippine claim that would echo through centuries. Fast forward to 1878, and the story gets even more complicated. Sultan Jamalul Alam of Sulu entered into an agreement with two European businessmen, Baron von Overbeck and Alfred Dent, who represented the British North Borneo Company. This document would become the most disputed piece of paper in Southeast Asian history. The key controversy? The original contract was written in an old variant of Malay, and whether it meant a lease or a cession remains hotly debated to this day. The Sulu interpretation, and later the Philippine governments, insist it was only a lease, meaning ownership was never surrendered. Malaysia, however, views it as a full cession, sealing Sabah's fate under their flag. What adds fuel to this historical fire is the money. The agreement included annual payments to the Sultan and his heirs, a practice Malaysia continued even after gaining independence. But in 2013, those payments were abruptly stopped, especially after the Lahad Datu standoff, an armed incursion into Sabah by followers of the Sultanate of Sulu. This action reignited emotions across the Philippines, with many Filipinos asking, if it was a full cession, why was rent still being paid?
Standoff in Sabah is over. The end of the almost 3 weeks long occupation Datu by followers of Sulu Sultan Jamalul Kiram III came after Malaysian security forces stormed the area.
The Philippine government formally stepped into the picture in 1962 when the heirs of the Sultan of Sulu authorized Manila to pursue the claim on their behalf. That same year, President Diosdado Macapagal lodged a formal assertion of sovereignty over Sabah to the British government, setting in motion decades of diplomatic friction. The Sultanate even issued a formal transfer of sovereignty to the Philippines, symbolically passing the torch. But decades later, in 1989 and again as recently as 2025, the Sultanate's descendants reasserted their own authority, saying they never intended to permanently surrender their rights, thus reopening questions of legitimacy. This deep historical foundation, rooted in royal politics, colonial ambition, and legal gray zones, remains the bedrock of the Philippine claim to Sabah. And with recent international arbitration rulings and revived interest from the Sulu heirs, the story is far from over. While the Philippines holds firm to its historical and legal claims, Malaysia isn't backing down, and its counter-arguments are just as layered, strategic, and emotionally charged. At the center of its position is the same 1878 agreement. But where the Philippines sees a lease, Malaysia sees a full and final cession of sovereignty. According to their interpretation, the British North Borneo Company legally acquired the territory, and that ownership was passed down in full, eventually leading to Sabah's rightful integration into the Malaysian Federation. But Malaysia's strongest argument may not lie in old documents, it lies in the voice of the people. In 1963, as part of the formation of Malaysia, the United Nations conducted a fact-finding mission at the request of not just Malaysia, but also Indonesia and the Philippines. The result? An overwhelming number of Sabahans expressed their desire to join Malaysia. Self-determination, Malaysia argues, is the cornerstone of modern international law. And the people of Sabah chose their future. For Kuala Lumpur, that moment was decisive. Since then, Malaysia has governed Sabah continuously and effectively. They point to decades of infrastructure development, democratic participation, and administrative control as proof that Sabah is not just Malaysian on paper, it's Malaysian in practice, every single day. This concept is known in international law as effective occupation, and it's a powerful tool for states to assert sovereignty. To further solidify its position, Malaysia has repeatedly labeled the Philippine claim as a non-issue, diplomatically brushing it aside as outdated and irrelevant. From Malaysia's perspective, reopening this case is not only unnecessary, but also a threat to regional stability and unity within ASEAN. Finally, Malaysia hasn't just rejected the Philippines' verbal assertions, it has consistently blocked Philippine submissions to international bodies like the United Nations, especially when it comes to claims over the continental shelf that extends from Sabah. These diplomatic rejections send a clear message. Malaysia is not entertaining negotiations over Sabah. Period. In Kuala Lumpur's eyes, the matter is closed. But in Manila, and among many Filipinos and descendants of the Sulu Sultanate, the fight is far from over. While guns have never been drawn between the Philippines and Malaysia over Sabah, the battlefield has shifted to legal courts, UN halls, and diplomatic corridors. And Manila, over the decades, has not remained silent. The Philippines' first major move came with the Manila Accord of 1963, signed by Malaysia, Indonesia, and the Philippines. This agreement made one thing crystal clear. Sabah's inclusion in the Malaysian Federation would not prejudice the Philippine claim. It was a diplomatic acknowledgement that the matter was unresolved and that it must be settled peacefully in accordance with international law. But while Malaysia interprets this accord as merely symbolic, the Philippines sees it as a cornerstone of legitimacy. Then came Republic Act 5446 in 1968, a bold legal step that redefined the Philippine territorial baselines and notably included North Borneo, Sabah, as part of its national domain. Despite its symbolic weight, it drew sharp responses from Malaysia and stirred debates in ASEAN. In more recent years, the Philippines has continued to make its presence known on the global legal stage. A March 2025 note verbale to the United Nations was just the latest in a series of documents reasserting sovereignty over Sabah. These usually come in response to Malaysia's objections to Philippine claims over the extended continental shelf, a resource-rich area extending from Sabah's coasts. But perhaps the most crucial move, legally speaking, is the Philippines' attempt to elevate the issue to the International Court of Justice, ICJ. Unfortunately, there's a catch. The ICJ requires both parties to consent to jurisdiction, and Malaysia has repeatedly declined. But the Philippine government isn't the only player anymore. The heirs of the Sultanate of Sulu have taken matters into their own hands, literally. In 2022, a European arbitration court awarded them a jaw-dropping $14.9 billion in compensation from Malaysia, citing the country's sudden halt of annual payments. Malaysia rejected the award outright, refusing to recognize its legitimacy. Still, the move made global headlines and reignited public interest in the forgotten royal family's role. These heirs didn't stop there. In a stunning twist, they revoked the 1962 transfer of sovereignty to the Philippine government. Their reason? Manila failed to act decisively, allowed the issue to fade, and didn't even include Sabah in the 1987 Philippine Constitution. Now, they're pursuing a separate direct claim, even seeking U.S. support for a 2004 petition to the United Nations, demanding restitution and justice. Malaysia, for its part, has drawn a hard line. It categorically rejects the arbitration rulings, branding them as opportunistic attempts to exploit historical ambiguity for financial gain. Kuala Lumpur insists that Sabah is an integral part of its territory, and that dredging up the dispute only threatens ASEAN unity and regional peace. The legal chessboard is active, but there's no checkmate in sight. For now, it's a tense standoff between diplomacy, royal legacy, international law, and national pride. What makes the Sabah dispute more than just a historical quarrel is its ripple effect across Southeast Asia, politically, economically, and even militarily. At the heart of it all is a fundamental question: can ASEAN remain united while two of its founding members quietly clash over territory? For decades, the Sabah claim has been a quiet source of friction between the Philippines and Malaysia. Though ASEAN follows a strict non-interference principle, such unresolved disputes challenge the bloc's image of unity and cohesion. Every diplomatic flare-up or legal filing threatens to weaken regional trust. especially in moments when ASEAN needs solidarity to face larger threats. The stakes aren't just political, there's an economic cost too. Investors value stability and ongoing legal battles over sovereignty, especially ones that could involve billions of dollars and potential unrest, send the wrong message. Trade, tourism, and development in Sabah and surrounding regions can all suffer under the shadow of geopolitical uncertainty. And then there's the elephant in the room, the South China Sea. The Philippines' renewed interest in Sabah is unfolding at the same time as major standoffs with China in contested maritime zones. Malaysia, too, has overlapping claims in the South China Sea. Now, Malaysia is rejecting the Philippines' continental shelf submissions, particularly when those claims project from Sabah's baselines. This means the Sabah issue isn't isolated. It's part of a bigger power puzzle, one that Beijing could exploit. This leads to a growing fear: external interference. Analysts have warned that global powers, especially China, could manipulate the Sabah issue to destabilize ASEAN from within. A distracted, divided bloc plays right into the hands of larger geopolitical players who thrive on disunity and distraction. Finally, let's not forget the human cost. In 2013, the Lahad Datu standoff saw followers of the Sulu Sultanate enter Sabah in a violent attempt to reclaim the land. The result? Deadly firefights, hostage situations, and diplomatic chaos. It was a stark reminder that this isn't just a paper war. It has the potential to explode into real-world conflict, affecting lives on both sides of the sea. In short, the Sabah issue is no longer just about history or legality. It's a live wire in the fabric of Southeast Asia's future. So, where does the long-running Sabah dispute stand today? While passions still run deep in certain circles, the possibility of military confrontation is virtually non-existent. Malaysia maintains tight administrative control over Sabah, and both countries remain committed, at least outwardly, to diplomacy and regional peace under ASEAN. But that doesn't mean the conflict is over. Far from it. Several potential resolution pathways exist, though none come without serious roadblocks. Bilateral diplomacy, while still alive, often stalls on the core issue. One side sees a lease, the other sees a cession. The legal route through the International Court of Justice remains blocked because it requires mutual consent, and Malaysia has consistently said no. Until that changes, the courtroom remains out of reach. Interestingly, the spotlight has shifted. The Sultanate of Sulu's heirs have pivoted away from sovereignty and toward financial restitution, winning multi-billion-dollar awards in international arbitration. Their fight for now appears more about compensation than land, though the symbolism of their claim continues to inspire heated debates across both nations. On the Philippine side, the current strategy is subtle but steady, maintaining the claim through UN diplomatic notes, legal positioning over maritime zones, and internal legislation. It's a dormant claim, kept alive on paper, perhaps waiting for a more favorable global or regional climate. Malaysia, however, remains immovable. Backed by the 1963 UN referendum, decades of governance and international recognition, Kuala Lumpur sees no reason to reopen the file. For them, Sabah is not up for negotiation, and never was. In reality, the Sabah issue is likely to linger in the background, flaring up in courtrooms, news headlines, and nationalist rhetoric, but unlikely to erupt into open conflict or dramatic change. Unless there's a major geopolitical shift or both parties agree to submit to binding arbitration, the dispute will remain unresolved, a thorn in the side of regional diplomacy